Okay, so in the last video, we started talking about heredity and genes, and essentially what we talked about is how through kind of the process of coding for proteins, these genes form the backbone of who we are and how we interact with the environment. And so what essentially is happening is these genes are stimulated by the environment to kind of activate and then code for the proteins that allow for our response. And so it's kind of like the idea of stress, this kind of environmental pattern coding for the proteins and the chemical messages like cortisol that are going to be incorporated in our body's response. So at kind of a big picture, this idea seems to me to be a lot like tea in hot water. So I'll draw a cup, and this is my cup, and it's got a bag of tea in it. And as the hot water, which in this instance would be the environment, kind of hits that tea, it essentially activates that tea bag and allows for that tea to kind of exude its flavor into the rest of the water. And so I'm sure you can imagine that this idea, this relationship between the environment and the genes becomes quite murky because even in this diagram, you know that the tea was kind of the nature of this tea, its flavors and its level of caffeination was determined already before it went into this hot water. That it was contained in that kind of packet attached to the string, but at the same time the environment, that hot water, the level of heat and the temperature determines kind of the extent to which these flavors get pulled into the rest of the cup. And so teasing apart this relationship between genes and the environments becomes quite difficult for scientists because ultimately there are really a lot of moving parts. So one of the hallmark characteristics of scientific experimentation is that it's difficult to answer more than one question at a time. I mean, we can answer or we can at least get a fairly clear answer if whether or not an event was stimulated by genetic predisposition, and we might be able to get an answer to whether or not the environment impacted something, but it becomes really hard to distinguish between whether it was the environment or genes at the same time. So we need a control. We need a way to either control for the environment or control for the genes, and that becomes quite difficult. But maybe out of the kindness of her heart, Mother Nature has set up a really awesome opportunity for us to kind of experiment with this process, and that comes in the form of twins, specifically identical twins. So I want to take a second and I want to clarify the difference between fraternal twins and identical twins. So let me write twins here, and I'll write fraternal and identical. And really the big picture here, the big difference is that identical twins are genetically identical while fraternal twins are carried in the same uterus at the same time as part of the same pregnancy, but they aren't genetically identical. So I'm going to offer us kind of a quick review of the biology behind this to clarify the difference, but to do that I'm going to set it up with a mother of the fraternal twins and a mother of the identical twins. And I'll try to give them different hairdos. And I'm sure no woman in the entire world appreciates this depiction of pregnancy, but I needed a really big womb to characterize the differences here. And so with fraternal twins, what you see happening is two eggs are fertilized at the same time, resulting in two separate pregnancies occurring kind of at the same time. So I've got two eggs and two different sperm. That's key. Two different sperm. There's one sperm, and here's another sperm right there. And what that results in is two different babies being carried in the same womb, at the same time. So we've got the blue baby from the blue sperm, and then the orange baby from this orange sperm. But But what you essentially have is two humans the same age, but ultimately they are not genetically identical. And so these, while fascinating, do not serve this purpose of controlling the genetic component of this question very well. And so kind of alternatively with identical twins, what you have is one egg being fertilized by one sperm. And let me kind of show how that's happening. We have one egg, and then we might have this one sperm, this green sperm, and what happens is it's split into two, or sometimes three, but it's split into two, and you have you kind of have two of these genetically identical fetuses being raised in the same womb. So we've got two of these green babies. Both come from the same egg and the exact same sperm. So they have the exact same genetic makeup. So what you have is this really incredible population where you can control for the genetic background and then look at traits and the development through the lifespan. And so, what an experiment might start to look at is as these kind of two genetically identical people grow up, we might look at particular traits like athleticism or personality, and we might look at the degree to which they're similar, because after all, outside of the womb, they have different environments with different experiences. And so if something like, personality has a higher degree of similarity in this identical twin population, as opposed to general society, general sibling similarity, or even, you can kind of compare it to these fraternal twins and say, if something like athleticism is more similar in identical twins than fraternal twins or the rest of society, maybe that has a high genetic component to that trait. And so as early scientists, they set up these experiments with identical twins, and they kind of started trying to tease apart the effects of genes and environment. Unfortunately, these experiments, while fascinating, kind of are exposed to some pretty harsh and real criticism. It becomes clear that the environments probably aren't so dissimilar as we might have guessed. It's pretty intuitive that identical twins, you see them dressed similarly, and they're kind of viewed by society as this really similar partnership. And so really we might attribute a lot of their similarities to their environment. Maybe they're both athletic because they played on all the same athletic teams in the same uniforms, or maybe their personalities are different or are really similar only because they're the same sex, where these fraternal twins, one might have been a boy or might have been a girl. But needless to say, while we kind of we're offered a lot of really nice information about genetic similarity, we're also kind of exposed to a lot of criticisms of this. So the nice things that come out of this might be things like genetic similarity and similarity of personality traits. So I'll just put check marks for similarity, and then kind of the criticism comes in from a high level of environment influence. So, and I'll kind of put a frowny face because that negates some of our conclusions. And so nature kind of is not without a response to these criticisms, which is pretty magical, because in this vast population of identical twins, there exists at least a smaller but formidable group of identical twins who are separated at birth. So we'll kind of show these twins kind of older, and these would be separated at birth. And so what you have here is this new sample kind of experimental group where now you can say their genes are certainly controlled and they're identical genetically, but now we can say that their environment certainly isn't a factor in the degree to which they are similar or dissimilar. And so what comes out of these studies is kind of these really magical results where you take two twins who are separated and raised on, in potentially even different countries, but certainly different environments, and they're reunited later in life to find out that they have chosen the same profession. Maybe they're both firefighters or something. But as exciting as these results are, and where we really want to say that these similarities show high levels of genetic involvement in these traits, this is still open to some pretty harsh criticisms. One, by nature, this sample population size is fairly small. There are only so many identical twins registered in psychological studies, and there's an even smaller component of those who were separated at birth and actually come back together and can be compared and contrasted. So the sample population size is small. And then another criticism is that if you put two people together, really any two people, whether they're genetically kind of related or not, and you give them an opportunity to find all of the areas of their life where they're really similar, that maybe even you and I could come up with some pretty fascinating similarities, even though there's no genetic background to those similarities at all. So that's another criticism. And then kind of lastly, really before their similarities are analyzed, often these twins have been reunited for several years. So maybe those similarities developed after they're kind of reunited when their environments were a lot more similar than might have been suggested. And so again, we're offered a lot of really kind of magical data about genetic predisposition to personality traits and other things, but again, we're exposed to some pretty harsh criticisms. And so it's disheartening to think that some of these results might be skewed, but I will say that it's pretty hard to stump the curiosity of behavioral geneticists, and they responded with an idea of kind of flipping this experimental model upside down. And so, at some point we said, well, it turns out it's really hard to prove a varied environment. And so why don't we flip that around? Why don't we control for the environment and go ahead and admit that these environments are really quite similar, and we'll vary the genetic background. And the platform for those studies became adoption. And so I'm sure that a lot of you kind of have an understanding of how adoption works, but I'll break that down for our purposes. We'll say that we have this kind of blue family, and so there's a biological father and mother, and this biological child. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this baby blue from the blue family, and we're going to put him over here with the pink family, with pink parents. So pink father and pink mother, and we're gonna add to this family this blue baby. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna see, as this child grows up, does he end up being more similar in these traits that we're looking at to his new parents who have raised him, or will he be more similar to the blue family? What if these pink parents aren't athletic at all and the child is really, really athletic, and come to find out these blue parents were also phenomenal athletes? And turns out these adoption studies offer a lot of really, really amazing results. And I know one of the kind of hallmark studies looked at schizophrenia. Earlier psychological studies have shown that a child raised in a home with parents that suffered from schizophrenia had a marked increased risk to developing schizophrenia later in life. But this allowed us to look at if a child has biologically schizophrenic parents, but is raised in a household without schizophrenic parents, is his or her likelihood of developing schizophrenia still higher than the general population? And the answer is yes. And so it's kind of a little bit harder to refute that schizophrenia had a genetic component. And so there are criticisms, to be sure, of these adoption studies as well, but they're a little bit harder to kind of poke into the faults of than the original identical twin studies, or even those studies showing twins separated at birth.